Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. Today we will be discussing structural violence and the roots of inequality. We tend to associate the word violence with only wars, terrorist attacks, crime, or religious extremism. However, there is a more ever-present form of violence that permeates every single relationship that we have with one another and how we operate in our economy and politics, and this defines the way that we live our life. The quality of our life is defined by another form of violence that we tend to just overlook. And this is in fact something that we consider as a problem that is less understood. And to understand more about this and get to see behind the veil of what causes not only social injustice and inequality, but also the lack of funding for our human rights, we will be discussing this topic with Joana Jesus from Portugal, living in the UK. Hello, Joana. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Marlen. Nice to be here as well.
So to our audience, keep in mind that this is a live transmission, so you can place comments and questions in the Google event. And if you are watching on the YouTube video, you can click on be part of the conversation and it will take you to the Google event. We will be talking for about 40 minutes, so please make sure that either your comment or your question is placed during that time frame. So Joana, for everyone this term can be a new thing, so can you please introduce us to what structural violence is and who came up with this concept at the same time?
Sure. So structural violence is a term that was brought by Johan Galtung during part of his peace research, and he came up with this term and definition based on any avoidable impairment on the access of basic human needs or any other human needs that we will without them we would suffer. So it could be access to basic health care, education, or we're talking about anything that we would that in our society would be considered as possible, but in reality is not so. And an example that he gave, which can be easily understood, is if the 18th century someone was to die of tuberculosis, that would be something normal. However, if that happens in today's world with the health system that we have in the majority of the countries, that is considered as a manifestation of structural violence, because for some reason that person did not receive the treatment that exists already. So it's a gap of what is possible and what actually happens in a given society.
So we were discussing also in our previous hangout with Mark Korsky about the role of the institutions to oppress society and essentially becoming the culprit so as to not really develop ourselves to what would be our fullest potential. And this begins with what we usually talk about here as the ability to have a dignified living, and how this is still something that is not satisfied worldwide. We are focusing maybe in some other conflicts, and we believe that poverty is something that will be ever present. So why is it then said that structural violence is invisible yet omnipresent, and we are not directly aware of it many times? How does it operate?
Yes, and that's something that's why I think it's really important to raise awareness about it, because as you're saying, it's invisible. Apparently we don't see it. It's not something that you would define as a personal violence where someone harms you and you feel it or you see it on TV and the media will show it. But it's more ingrained in the regulations, in anything that actually implies that certain decisions are not considering everyone, and that people actually deciding upon those regulations or rules or anything that creates the system where we live, they are not actually being created, or it's not being solved by everyone that will be affected by it. And when it comes to international regulation and international institutions, it's really hard to find who is responsible for that violence that in the end will affect the person, like everyone. And throughout the Hangout, we can also talk about examples that even as in wealthy societies, we also suffer from these consequences, even though we may not immediately associate with certain regulations that will affect our lives. So actually, one of the studies that I was reading as part also from my study or my master's was that how the percentage of the wealth in the world is concentrated by the few countries, the wealthy ones, and what also means that they're going to have much more experience when it comes to negotiation, and they have much more bargaining power when it comes to to agree on something. And at the same time, if you in many of those decisions, and that's something that we may not be yet aware of, is that they are decided on by the elite. And when it comes to, when I talk about elite, is any country that is considering the Northern Hemisphere, which has a great economic power, and those that we would think, okay, but that's unacceptable, why aren't the other countries participating, when in fact those agreements are being accepted by corrupt politicians and authoritarian regimes that will accept kind of a trade-off that unfortunately will not benefit the populations. So that's I think now what we're facing is the consequence of these years and decades of these type of regulations that do not consider what is best for all and do not invite everyone to actually be part of the solution and deciding upon the future where we live.
Yes, we will get more into detail about these international institutions. Before we continue, we have some comments by Arnaud Priemos. Sorry if I didn't pronounce it correctly. Thank you for watching. And he's saying, I agree, Joanna, it is a political problem, not a technological one. Would you say it's not invisible but ignored, like police state and internet censorship?
Well, that's an interesting question. And in the end of the day, that censorship is going to affect someone. And if it's visible, I think that nowadays the media are still focused too much on the immediate violence, the very short-term violence that we see, that I think it could be prevented if the structural violence had been flagged up much beforehand. So if we look at preventing those type of situations where that violence, such as well, censorship in a way, it could be considered as a form of violence. But at the same time, if we look at why that censorship exists, what is that underneath that decision? Is that certain ideas that would affect the way that system is built upon, and that's why there's this kind of suppression of information, because it could make the system collapse, let's say. So I'm not so familiar with the internet censorship as part of a structural violence, but probably is.
I would say that in terms of the freedom of information and the various activists that are very much focusing on this, it does hinder, as Joanna was saying, that the fact that people can be well informed and so understanding better how the system operates, such as how structural violence operates and how it is very ingrained in the institutions that we take as the ones that place the order and control in the world, and we don't regularly question them. Even more so today, we are getting to know more facts that enables us to realize that we have never really been able to democratically choose who is at the head of these institutions, which we will be also discussing further. And in terms of the ignored type of violence, in this case, an example is a terrorist attack in France, where 12 people died, another police officer died, while over 20,000 people die every single day of hunger, and that is not world news. So that is part of the topic that we will be continuing talking about here. So thank you, Arnaud, for your comments. And so Joanna, let's continue a little bit on this. Can you give us some examples of more of this kind of structural violence in relation to inequality, or how do we relate to it directly? How can we spot it in our lives, so to speak?
Okay, so we still look at the differences between the lifestyle in a developed country, which is like the northern hemisphere, and then the developing countries. If we look at our day-to-day lives as a citizen that has a job and has the normal concerns, I would say that structural violence is very much ingrained in how we deal, for instance, with stress. And you may not consider that as an immediate consequence or manifestation, but I do see that at the level, if we bring it into more of a personal level, that affects us in every decision we take. And that is also how the money reaches, the money available for certain classes of the population. And I'm sure that a lot of people relate to the constant struggle that sometimes is just unconscious and you go through. So I would say that stress is clearly a manifestation of the structural violence, because people see that no matter how hard you try, sometimes certain things will not just be available for you. It's just the way the system is designed. So the structure in itself, only very few, it's like a tunnel. So there's a very, like, or a pyramid, or every you want to use the example, but it's the very structure of the system where we live. But then if you are in another country where you would see a structural violence in a different way. So, for instance, even access to basic healthcare, where here in London you would have it almost taken for granted, or at least for the majority of the people, whereas the majority of the people in an African country or in Southeast Asia, in certain societies, that will not be there for them. And then we also talk about other types of structural violence. Even they talk about something called cultural violence. So in societies where women are prevented from accessing certain resources, such as education, that is also a form of violence because it's a discrimination, or the same with certain ethnic groups.
We had a server problem, but we are back. So we left off where you, Joanna, were talking about the importance of stopping barriers between the developed and the developing countries. So please continue from there.
So what has been so far happening is there's this massive gap when it comes to the consequences of structural violence, is that in certain countries, specifically more in the south, we still see that there's a case of life or death. Whereas in the northern hemisphere or the more developed countries, that is not the case, but then you assist at other factors that will affect your daily life. And it can also end up in being a matter of life and death if people really burn out and they can die from stress or heart attack due to economic struggles in the north, or even suicide. So we can also look at those as part of the inherent violence that will come from a system that actually doesn't have life and the guarantee of life as something for everyone, and that is taken like by default. One example that I think when we went offline, I was speaking about was when it comes to studying genocide or mass murdering and any kind of consequence that usually we associate to a political conflict. But while I was doing the research on we will add those resources in the description of the video. But if we look and we dig deeper into what is actually creating such genocides or situations that jeopardize the whole humanity, there's actually a structural violence. And for instance, the conflict in Rwanda, there was already seeds of conflict 50 years before it actually happened. So since then, there was already a crisis in the coffee market. There was environmental degradation, a lack of access to the resources and resources scarcity, and that created a big fear in the population. And obviously what happened was that these extremist politicians used that for their own benefit, and that separated the populations even more. And there you see how a simple situation that could have been prevented if the market wasn't that fragile, and if the people's lives was not so dependent on a volatile economic system and market that actually do not consider the consequences of a decision, then certain situations in the world, such as genocide, could have been prevented. And what strikes me is that when we are studying, for instance, the post-genocide, and when we're talking about the international criminal courts, the fingers go into the people that committed those murders. But at the same time, they were a result of the system where they were brought up. So that it's like, when it comes to structural violence, it's really hard to identify who's responsible. And that's not maybe what we need. What we need is to simply revise the existing design and see what needs to change in order to prevent those situations to happen again.
Yeah, so that's where structural violence actually leads to what we commonly know as violence, such as genocide, or directly seeing someone having a gun pointing at your head because they want your money. We don't tend to look at how are criminals created. Why is poverty existent so that a person has to resort to such violent ways to get something to eat? This is something that we tend to overlook and believe that we only have to protect ourselves from. So I would say that it is also structural violence that we give more money to defense budgets and military budgets and fight these wars with created boogeymen, instead of focusing on how can we prevent this constant and ongoing war between countries that could be developed in a peaceful manner if proper agreements and proper communication was taking place in that. So, Joana, your point and forte is diplomacy. How would diplomacy also support the solution to structural violence?
So one key area that hasn't had yet the attention that, in my opinion, it should have is actually the psychology behind and dynamics behind decision making. And what I mean by psychology is actually the influences, either cultural influences or historical influences, when it comes to coming to the table and discussing a topic and the perceptions that exist. The other thing as well that is lacking is a holistic approach of meaning what is the different scenarios that can be drawn and then that could be prevented. So if we can identify certain patterns in history and we understand what's going to happen, and if you study history, I'm sure that majority of the people identify aspects that they can see throughout time, and chronologically speaking, it's exactly the same thing happening in a different scenario. So if that can be given more attention, then any person could also raise a question when certain decisions are taken, and then that holistic approach would also consider the long term. So when decisions are taken on a more sustainable perspective, I would say. So in diplomacy, I think there's a big way to walk. There are already very interesting authors writing about that and applying those tools, which is very good. One of them, for example, is the psychology of peacekeeping, or even the psychology of diplomacy itself. And an interesting area, and that is, it's still related to structural violence, but it's also the perceptions that countries still have about each other. And they take advantage of that. And that should never be the case if we are really focused on cooperation and focused on building up an humanity and recognizing the interdependencies. So nowadays no conflict is isolated. And that is something that, for example, the Millennium Development Goals that are due to end this year, on the goal number 8 was exactly on the global partnership towards development. And what we see here is like as if we are inverting policies that have been done 70 years ago. So, for example, if we look at the structural adjustment program that IMF had some time ago, now what we're looking at is almost an inversion of that. So now we see that as part of the goal number 8, you have tariff and quota-free access for the export of the developing countries. You have debt relief, so a debt that has been created as well by these international organizations, cancellation of official bilateral debt, and more generous relationships and trade agreements with those countries, recognizing that, hey, we cannot deal, and we have to adapt. Each case is a case, and we have to adapt the circumstances to make sure that everyone is better off. And in the end of the day, everyone is going to benefit from that. And another example that has been discussed is how, if you look at norms on disability, you need to consider that if a building needs to be built based on that, there has to be different stairs and different, or actually you don't have stairs, you have something like an elevator or something to adapt to that disability. The same happens with countries that are less developed. They cannot cope with the same norms and certain levels of decisions that will affect them, and they're simply not prepared. And I think there is this kind of judgment when it comes to developed and less developed countries, that we should use that as a starting point to not perpetrate that even more. And that's where diplomacy can also have a voice.
And when we look at what we propose as a living income guaranteed proposal, we do agree, of course, with and starting with a new slate, so to speak, because that is definitely part of structural violence. When you indebt third world countries through this structural adjustment program, it will be obvious that that country will be completely deprived of their right to properly develop themselves, and that is the cause of poverty. Hunger is a man-made situation. This kind of third world status is also man-made. There are sufficient resources, there is enough for everyone, so it is also part of us now informing ourselves of how that has been placed on purpose to create the inequality necessary, because once that you have power and dominion over these countries and their resources, then you will kind of have them do as you please. And this is precisely what is a violation of human rights, because people having no access to resources that are rather exported to other countries for profit doesn't make any sense in common sense. So let's look at how would the living income guaranteed proposal, from your perspective, be a holistic approach in relation to not only solving structural violence, but also enabling people to be more politically involved.
Well,
manage our resources, for example.
Sure. This far what happens, and this is something that Galtung also defined, is that you have the top dogs and then you have the underdogs. And the top dogs they own the resources, and then they distribute or not distribute the resources in an equal fashion. But then what has never happened until now is actually where the access to those resources is shared. And so there is nowadays that the command of those natural resources, or that which you define as the power that defines a nation, is access to those natural resources, is still being controlled by a few minority, and then which is the minority, which are always a few people. But then then what we do with League is to break that chain off and analyze what would happen when that access to resources is actually seen as a shared right. And from that moment on, all those layers that we see that are contributing to the struggle that will affect each citizen in the world to a degree or another, that will automatically fall off, because that's the whole point, is when there is this tunnel that actually limits our access to basic human needs. And for the first time in history, that doesn't need to be the case. We have the technology, we have the ability to make so. So I think that is the main thing, is how League and together with all the initiatives that already look at more of this holistic approach can actually thrive into making sure that those organizations can adapt and redesign their system in a way that will prevent us from then having to invert everything again. So we're like the same history over and over.
Many times the blame is placed on corporations, and we were discussing previous to this hangout how they are above many times of any form of governmental rule, and so they are governing themselves and being behind what we democratically can vote on or decide on. But within the consideration of living income as a proposal and political measures that can be implemented, it implies that if you want a corporation to, let's say, work in Mexico, then you, with the application of making of people the effective shareholders of, let's say, the oil company here, then if any form of international or private investment decides to come here and make business, they have to cope with the fact that that oil belongs to the people and that the profit has to be shared between the people and give a little percentage to these private investments. So it is not closing off to any sort of external investment, but at the same time ensuring that what we should be entitled to as our basic resources and national resources that we make the most of the money from can cover our living income as a human right, which is that money comes from our entitlement to human right as resources, as our access to that which makes the wealth of a nation. And it might not be a natural resource, it might be any other industry in some other countries. This is one of the proposals that we have so as to make people participant and effectively know that they are entitled to the benefit from these resources, which is something that if we apply to Africa, they would not be starving, they would not be the poorest nations in the world and continent. So this is something that can be done, but we do have to kind of, first of all, create this awareness of what is possible to make us effectively entitled to this human right. So in this, how would you say, Joana, that we can proceed? Self-awareness and creating this kind of shows and information is a first point, but what would you see would be the most challenging in relation to how to deal with corporations, for example?
What I see is that there has to be this joint willingness to make that happen, and then people that are involved, they should not define themselves as separated from the rest of the world. Because when that happens, obviously a decision is going to only take in their own interests and not considering what is best for all. And at the same time, we also have to make to think for ourselves and seeing that it is possible. Like any design that exists nowadays, any structure, any law, everything has been created by us as human beings. And we are still facing that this and even the way we are educated is to believe that this is how things are, and they will never going to change, and this is going to be the same thing. But in the end of the day, that's not true, and we can see there has been already some improvement. But it's, I think, bringing the topic of structural violence, of actually seeing where each, let's say, transnational corporation, their involvement in every chain of the process, how is that actually perpetrating structural violence? So accepting that is actually happening, and do not, it's not blaming, but simply taking responsibility. And that is a big step, I think. That is like recognizing that it's not about one single person is not going to change the world. So that is like the first thing. And also that there are certain things that need to change. And when it comes to access to those resources, that's where probably psychology is actually going to help in people to recognizing that, hey, the value of that person is exactly the same as yours. You're not more and you're not less. You have to face it, like no egos here. And that is, I think, is a big change in some people's minds, because we are educated to compete with each other, and we are recognized when we are considered better or superior. So bringing down this equality and not fearing to call it, like I see a lot of words now, we're talking about parity or any words that can define as we all have equal value. So I think, and that applies to corporations, but it also applies to governments and applies to any given group in a society that has a contribution, and that can definitely be part of this new design. And finally, as part of that, I think there's going to be a lot of changes in the financial industry, and they have to have, in terms of where agreements are made and the starting point for those agreements as well. And eventually the existing, what actually it's called, they call it a pathology, pathologies of power, which is already considered as a pathology, as something that exists as like a vicious circle or cycle that definitely needs to stop once and for all.
Yes, and also we have to consider that it is doable. Many times we say, oh no, we're never going to be able to a little bit remove the amount of power that these institutions and certain people in the world system have. But we have to always keep in mind we are the majority, and we are the ones that should be more and more focusing on what can we do to start, let's say, curbing the growing inequality, as it is also the title of this hangout, how from this structural violence, which is ingrained in the structure in which we move our lives in an economic, political, social manner, then we have to consider how we are the only ones that at the same time can create an alternative to it, some alignments and corrections. And I consider that with the living income proposal, we do precisely that, because it's not only focused on taking power off certain individuals. It's not really about that. It is about collective empowerment. And as you're saying, Joana, it begins by defining what our right to have a dignified living is and how we can fund it, which is through the provision of a living income. Everyone should be entitled to it, or have better working conditions, better wages, because that is the way to stop any form of debasement of our human life and the life of the earth, because there's also environmental structural violence, and there's all kinds of structural violence. But for the sake of this hangout, Joana, I'd like you to share what your personal perspective is in relation to how to cope at the moment with this information, because many people can take it as, oh my God, it is just never going to be solved, this is too much, we are never going to make it. So what would you suggest as to how to take this information and even the actions that you've taken in order to be part of the solution?
Okay, so first, if you feel overwhelmed by any kind of information, just stop and breathe. It's a very simple exercise, but it definitely works. And then when it comes to analyzing the information, it's important to have filters on. Filters on in terms of not being affected emotionally by any kind of information. Because as we discussed in the beginning of this hangout, a lot of the things that we see in the media are about personal violence. And that kind of violence, it is important to be aware of, but we must allow ourselves to look deeper and to see what is actually behind that. And when we see that, that's where change can happen, and that's where prevention can occur. And then in your own life, obviously you can prevent certain things from happening as long as you are well informed. So being well informed and perhaps spending more time reading or watching documentaries instead of playing games or any other thing that it's more about entertainment than anything else. And other things will be also to, and this is something interesting, which is to work on the reactions. So if for some reason you see any blame towards anyone or anything in this society, and then you certainly project all your attention into that, remind yourself that you are projecting the attention to the wrong direction, meaning the attention should be to the solution, because of course there are so many problems in the world, and as we were analyzing, there are genocides happening, but now we need to empower ourselves to look at what will we do in a few years' time, what tools and what skills we need to build up within ourselves in order to be part of that, in order to bring onto the table, and not thinking that we are limited in any way whatsoever. Because nowadays, and obviously I'm talking from someone that I was brought up in Europe, so I had access to certain resources that majority of the people don't have. That's also part of my responsibility, and that's where I'm going to give what I have received. So having this in mind will also help you to share information, for instance, to be more aware that there are things that can be done locally, nationally, and then internationally. So that's the kind of holistic approach. So don't judge yourself if there's certain information that you might not feel comfortable with. You just need to practice more and perhaps read more about it. And I think nowadays, there was something that while you're talking, Marlen, I was considering, is that we had a very great help from corporations in terms of the structures that we have in place. That they were the kind of the engines to have certain structures in place. So we can always decide what to do with them. Either we create a crisis, either we create well-being. So I think there's always decisions to take, and this is where common sense is really important to have. And finally, there has to be a very big and important shift on moving from self-interest to what is best for all. And that is like the biggest shift that can happen, because it's ingrained in our own education that we need to be competitive and take care of ourselves and our own, but then our families, and then we don't recognize our responsibility as part of one humanity. And when it comes to being a being on this earth, it doesn't really matter your social status or where you're coming from. We're all equal. And when it comes to environmental degradation, it's going to affect us all. So having more of this shared and common goal as to what is best for all, that will definitely assist us of which career we're going to take, how we're going to position ourselves in order to bring that change. So that will be my advice.
I fully agree with that, specifically with how to not wallow in depression upon getting to know more about how this ever-present structural violence affects our lives, but rather to use it as a point of self-motivation. Okay, I'm going to be part of this, so where can I begin? How can I begin investigating more? How can I ensure that I focus right away on the solutions? And that's what we also make these hangouts for. And this would also, taking it from the hangout that we had with Mark Korsky on the engines of domination, he does say that institutions can be changed. As you were mentioning, the structure is there. We are the ones that have to define how it operates, and that is not impossible to change because it is a man-made thing. Just as poverty and hunger are a man-made thing, we can prevent them at the same time. We have a comment from Arnaut once again, and he's saying, awareness here is growing but repressed by bias and straight out of lying mainstream media, though Europe is in growing state of unrest in that sense. I guess that the role that the media is having is a key aspect, and it's also very important to kind of expand into other sources of information. Alternative media is one, but at the same time also not focus on getting to kind of soak in a lot of information, but also search for practical and viable solutions that are applicable, such as what we propose as a living income guarantee proposal. Joana, what would you say on this?
Yes, that's true. Exactly what you said, Marlen. And probably, yeah, watching less TV would be a good thing. Like when it comes to the mainstream TV, and hopefully, I think teachers could also have a word on that, and to motivate people to read more and to also write more. write, participate, write your own blog, see what is not working and why, and share it, and then you'll see where it takes you.
Expanding common sense is the most powerful tool, and we are at that stage. So keep tuning in to these Hangouts, because we do focus on that, and we always are willing to understand the problem and look at the solution. And if we haven't considered it, then we can create it, because that's our potential as human beings at the same time. The real capital is life and our creativity at the same time. And so it is to also empower ourselves with these ideas and not simply get subsumed in this whole realm of lots of information and seeing no way out. There is a way out, so investigate what we're proposing at the same time, and join us, of course. So, Joana, thanks a lot for this discussion. It has been very informative, but at the same time, with the last section, you do give us a sense of there is a way out, there is a solution, and we can be part of it, so thanks for that.
You're welcome, Marlen. And perhaps just before we leave, one thing that I wanted to just talk quickly about, which is sometimes you have this need of gathering a lot of information and knowledge. And it's like you think, oh, I need to have this degree, or I have to read this, or I have to memorize all of that. But from my experience, that tiredness and that constant state of like, oh, I know too little, I don't know enough, so I cannot speak about it. Obviously, there has to be some research done and dedication, and at the same time, don't feel limited by all those self-judgments. And what I mean by that is, like, if we look at the conflict that is happening, and we think it's completely out there, it has nothing to do with me, so I don't have to worry about it, try to bring that conflict onto yourself. And that is something that I've been applying in diplomacy, and that's where actually my thesis is going to be about that. It's like, how can you bring conflicts onto your own reality and see what would you do in that situation? How can you place yourself in someone else's shoes and see what can you change within you? Because one day, yes, you're going to probably be in that situation, and you have to face other perspectives or a situation of potential conflict. So I think bringing that and don't seeing the world as separated from you, don't seeing information as separated from you, and also don't define by your own background, so to speak, because there's the information and the flow of information in this world. So wherever you're coming from, I think any limitation nowadays is more in the mind than in reality.
Yes, we have the internet. We're talking transcontinentally here, and we are having people watching from Brazil, from Europe. So thanks for watching at the same time. So yeah, we are still together on this. So yeah, you speak Portuguese. So thanks a lot, Joana, once again, and we'll probably have you some other time discussing on this conflict resolution process that you're walking in your master's degree. So that would be very interesting at the same time.
Happy to do so. Thank you, Marlen.
And thanks to you for watching. Sorry about the server problems, Google Hangouts, live situation. It does happen. So see you next week. We will be discussing about copiosis, and I will leave links later on in the page so that you can investigate further to place questions for these guys. And at the same time, remember that we are here every Sunday, so keep in contact with us if you have any comments, questions, or if you want to be part of these discussions. Thanks for listening, watching, and see you next time. Bye, Joana.
Bye-bye.